Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to go over the debrief on the impact of the Stop the Tories campaign on the general election. Essentially, what was the impact and what was their accuracy? Well, let's look at the accuracy first. Incredibly important. There were other groups trying to get people to vote tactically. I pushed stopthetories.vote because, as I repeatedly said, their methodology was sound. They were the only group with a track record of accuracy going into this election, having been the only group who even bothered to try and organise for, say, the local elections. And local elections are much tougher. And yet Stop the Tories basically had, like, it was something like 90% accuracy in terms of recommending the right party in the local elections in raw terms, and 100% accuracy in not getting the decision wrong in a way that let a Tory win. Well, it was even better for the general election. In no seat did they recommend the wrong party where a Tory won, just as with the local election. So 100% accuracy from that point of view. The only holes in the advice there were 6 seats where the site didn't give a firm recommendation. It may have said, oh, it's between Labour and the Greens or Labour and the Lib Dems, but it didn't give this is the tactical vote. But when you look at the results, one of those parties did do way better than the others, and therefore it would have been possible to have given a definite piece of advice, but there wasn't enough information. The group wouldn't have had enough. Some people will say, oh, but on the ground we knew it was this, and that'll be true. In all of those seats, the people on the ground probably would have known. The problem is that when you then try, because lots of people apparently try and email stopthetories.vote and go, oh, you should be recommending us. And most of the time, they're actually wrong. I actually got accidentally copied into an email. So I'm assuming it was a viewer that tried to tell them. Copied into it. I'm not going to give names or anything like that. But it was a particular place where this happens to be a Lib Dem group that was going, we should be the tactical vote for these reasons. And you look at the results, they got no votes. They got no votes. It was obviously Labour. It was Labour all day long. And you get a lot of that. So just because someone comes in, I'm local to there and I have this information, they don't know it's accurate. So the judgment was made. The advice should only be offered if you're confident about the call. And I would agree with that. I think it's better for me to say that where the advice was offered, which was hundreds and hundreds of seats, that advice was 100% correct. It's just that there were 6 seats where it was too tough to call, where, okay, if they'd have had the better intelligence, that would have made it easier. And when you look at the results, it was like, yeah, okay, there was a clear case there, but it wasn't obvious at the time. Now, there were more than 6 seats where definite advice couldn't be given, but all the rest were too tough to call, even in hindsight. Like Isle of Wight East, classic example. Stop the Tories said, look, we know it's between the Labour and the Greens, we just don't know who. And the result had basically the same number of votes for both Labour and the Greens. So even in hindsight, you wouldn't have been able to look at it and go, oh yeah, we should have backed them or them. So there's only 6 seats where that was the case. Now you compare that with Best for Britain, who got their advice wrong, not just couldn't give definitive advice, but actually got wrong advice in 14 seats. So wrong advice, Stop the Tories.vote, 0 seats. Best for Britain, 14 seats. And in some of those seats, the Tory candidate actually won. In some of them, it ended up not making a difference. In some of them, the Tory won. So if a lot of people were taking the Best for Britain advice, then they helped the Tories in some seats. And that is the problem with not getting your methodology right. Now, that's not me picking a fight here, by the way. Best for Britain, a really good force for progressive change. I hope they do some good over the next few years. I absolutely support them. I'm just trying to point out, I knew stopthetories.vote had the right approach, which is why I promoted them. And once again, the results have proven themselves. So that's the accuracy. Now we ask about the reach. Well, Best for Britain had an advertising budget. They're a much larger group. So they obviously had the much greater reach. They also have links with the media and political parties, so their potential to make their voices heard over the next few years is greater. But in terms of the impact on the election, I can't say, because Best for Britain are not going to publish their internal data. They'd be mad to, I wouldn't. So I can only go over what I've got from stopthetories.vote. In terms of people accessing the site, there were 3 ways to use Stop the Tories to inform your tactical vote choice. The first was the postcode search, the second was the browse function, and the third was people not using the site at all, but getting their advice from people who did. So let's go over those one at a time. First of all, the postcode search. This is the one for which there is the clearest evidence of impact. If you use a postcode search, you're almost certainly using it for your own tactical vote, your own area. 1.75 million people use this function. I can also say that most of the postcode searches were for areas where the tactical vote was not obvious. So that was a good sign that it wasn't just people finding out about the site and using it for their own areas. It was specifically people who were thinking, I actually need tactical voting advice because I don't know who it is around here. So that's brilliant. How much of an impact is 1.75 people on this election? Well, let's break it down. So assumption time. Going to assume that the vast majority of people who used the function intended to vote. Yes, it's possible some did it out of curiosity and didn't vote. But if someone wasn't going to vote in the election, would they really be messing about with a tactical voting website? Like one or two, I can't imagine many. Tactical voting is like the most engaged form of voting. So it's really hard to imagine someone who didn't vote, the least engaged, using the most engaged form of voting. So with that assumption, you're talking about 6% of the people who voted. Straight away, that's a good chunk of the voter base. However, we can do a bit better than that. The site only recommended one of 5 parties to best challenge the Tories, where the Conservative candidate was considered a credible threat. So we shouldn't really use the total number of voters for our base, because we weren't helping anyone who wanted to vote Tory or Reform. You know, it's the number who were voting for one of those 5 parties. So the total number of people voting for either Labour, Lib Dems, Green, SNP or Plaid was 16.1 million. So another assumption now, there might have been the odd Tory or Reform voter who used the postcode search out of curiosity, or someone in Northern Ireland, even though it wasn't giving any advice for Northern Ireland. But I'm going to assume, although they wouldn't have used a postcode search, it wouldn't have really worked very well. But I'm going to assume that a site called stopthetories.vote did not attract many Conservative and Reform voters. So I'll say that the effective proportion of voters reached by the site was actually 11% now. Again, we may say 10% if we want to sort of say, well, get out the curiosity votes, the searches, sorry. So the site postcode search used by 10, 11% of the people that it needed to be used by. For a group without an advertising budget and whose only mainstream media exposure was via Carol Vorderman's efforts, that's pretty big. But I also said that most of the traffic was for seats that were tough ones to call. So this 11% wasn't spread out across the country. It was concentrated more in the areas that needed the information. Now, I can't put numbers on at this point because you'd need some proper analysis by data scientists, and there's no budget for that. But you can certainly get the impression that the group made a difference with figures like this. But the postcode search was only one way of getting the tactical vote information. There was the browse function. That was accessed by another 1.5 million. That was an extra 1.5 million roughly. But I can't use that figure to say anything credible because, like I say, the browse function could easily be, and probably more suitably for people just checking up on constituencies of interest that weren't their own. I mean, that's what I used it for. The postcode search is the easiest way to get your own. But it's safe to say some people would have gotten their information from the browse function. I just can't say how many. Then there's the grassroots promotion. Stop the Tories brought a lot of people together in Discord to promote the campaign locally with flyers, posters, word of mouth. So some of that 10, 11% of people voting for progressive parties who used Stop the Tories would have promoted the same tactical voting advice to people they knew who then didn't need to access the site. Can't possibly say how many that would have been. Could have been loads, but it would certainly have been significant. Also, it's reasonable to suppose that grassroots supporters would have been pushing the message hardest in the target seats, in the ones where it was really in the balance. In other words, where the advice was likely to have the most impact. After all, it's these seats where most of the traffic came from, so we can safely assume this is where most of the word of mouth was happening as well. So the campaign will absolutely have had an impact. The other campaigns will have been of benefit as well. So the cumulative impact has shaped the results. So well done to everyone who got involved. The question is what happens now? Well, remember, the purpose of Stop the Tories was not just to beat the Tories down as much as possible. That's just a means to an end. Tactical voting is a degenerate fix to a bad system. The ultimate aim of the groups behind tactical voting is to change the system so that it doesn't have to happen. In fact, as a little aside, it's worth noting the tactical voting worked so well that for a lot of people, they didn't need to do it. You know, people don't want to vote tactically. The people who vote tactically are doing it pragmatically, not because it's fun. It's just, you know, some people realise they have to. The Green Party results, very interesting. So they won 6.8% of the vote. Now, this is roughly in line with their polling during most of a parliamentary cycle. It's roundabout where their natural level of support is. It's just that when the election comes along, Green supporters realise electoral reality, that in the vast majority of places they're not going to win, and they'd really rather stop the Tories. And then they vote pragmatically for a party more likely to win in their area, and bosh, vote share in elections drops to about 3%. It was like 2.7% at the last election, as in, it's now the election before, I suppose, 2019. And some Ashcroft polling showed that a lot of Green voters did wait until the last minute before making the decision, because the polling was asking, when did you make your decision? For Green voters, noticeably, a great many of them really waited to the last few days. The conclusion being, they were prepared to vote tactically as usual, as they normally would, but because in those final few days they were assured of the Labour majority, they felt that they were able to vote as they wanted, which is how everyone should be able to do it. So for some voters, and it won't have just been Green voters, it would be others as well, for some voters, the efficiency of Labour and the Lib Dem campaign, along with the organisation of the tactical vote, actually did allow some people to vote as they would like without feeling that they would be acting as handmaidens to a Tory government. And this is what it should be like. This is what we should have. A representative electoral system that rewards parties and candidates who win the most votes, where everyone's vote counts roughly the same. I don't think there's any perfect system, but more people should count. At the moment, it's what 1% of voters are the difference between a Labour and a Conservative majority. Like, you know, it's been pointed out, in fact, it's fewer than 1% in this election. If you'd have been able to handpick fewer than 1% of the votes cast in this election and flipped them in certain places, you would have gone from what we got was a large Labour majority, you could have flipped it right back to a Conservative majority. That's ridiculous. And this is the ultimate aim of the Stop the Tories campaign: marshal a load of voters to help displace the Tories, with the objective being to then push for electoral reform. If you signed up to the newsletter, then you'll be able to carry on helping this cause. I will, of course, be talking about this next phase, pushing for electoral reform, more in the future. But in terms of how things went in the election, that's what I know. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.